Marcus said he loved me. He said it every morning over coffee, every night before sleep, like a man who had memorized the words but never felt them. I believed him. I defended him. I stood by him through every broken promise and every debt he pretended didn't exist. But the night he led me into that room, that dark, expensive room that smelled of cedarwood and danger, I finally understood what I had always been to him. Collateral. He sat across the glass table, smiling that easy smile I used to think was charm, and he counted the money. Stack after stack. He didn't look at me once. Not once. He sold me like a man clearing out old furniture, without hesitation, without guilt, without even the decency of a goodbye. He thought he was handing me to a low-level debt collector. Someone disposable and forgettable. He thought my story ended in that room. What Marcus didn't know, what no one in that city knew, was that the man sitting in the shadows across from him, the man with the obsidian eyes and the ink-black tattoos running up his arms like a map of 1,000 battles, was not just a collector. He was Mong Kwan. And Mong Kwan didn't just own the debt. He owned the entire city. Before we start, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to this channel. Let me know in the comments. Has someone you trusted ever betrayed you for money? Tell me your story. I read every single one. It truly means a lot to see our Fearless Love Chronicles family growing every single day. Every like, every comment, every share helps us bring more powerful stories to more women who deserve to see themselves as the main character. And I am so grateful we get to build this world together. Now, stay with me until the very end. Because I promise you, by the time this story is over, you will never look at a quiet man in a dark room the same way again. The chandelier above the glass table was the most beautiful thing in the room, and I remember staring at it because I couldn't bear to look at anything else. It hung low from the coffered ceiling of the study, a cascade of crystal drops catching the amber light and scattering it across the walls in broken, trembling fragments. The kind of light that made expensive things look holy. The kind of room that made men feel powerful just by standing in it. Marcus had brought me here without explaining why. He said it was a business meeting. He said I needed to be there, that my presence would help smooth things over, that he just needed a few minutes and then we could go to dinner the way we had planned. He had even touched my face in the elevator, 2 fingers under my chin, tilting my face up the way he always did when he wanted me to believe him. I had believed him. That was my curse. The man behind the glass table didn't stand when we entered. He didn't speak. He was seated in a heavy leather armchair that had been positioned facing the door, as if he had known exactly when we would arrive, exactly how we would look walking in, and had already decided what we were worth before either of us opened our mouths. His black shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the ink on his forearms, dark sweeping patterns that moved like smoke frozen in skin, caught the light as he rested one hand against the arm of the chair. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at me. Not the way men usually looked at me, not with hunger or assessment or casual dismissal. He looked at me the way a chess player looks at the board before making the move that ends the game. So, absolute. Already finished. I felt it then, that first cold thread of something wrong, but I told myself it was nerves. I told myself it was the room. Marcus stepped forward and placed both hands on the table. The stacks of cash were already there, piled in neat, deliberate towers on the glass surface. I don't know when they had been prepared. I don't know how long this room had been waiting for us. Marcus reached into his jacket and slid a folded document across the table without a word, his fingers trailing over the bills the way a man touches something he has already decided to keep. I watched his face. That was when I knew. There was no fear in him. No shame. No hesitation. He had the expression of a man completing an errand. Efficient, relieved, slightly impatient to be done. The trembling I had seen in the elevator was gone. In its place was something slack and unburdened, the face of a man who had just set down a weight he had been carrying for too long. That weight was me. Isabelle. His voice was so ordinary. He said my name like he was introducing me to a colleague at a company event. He gestured slightly with one hand. Come forward, stand here, and the gesture was so casual, so practiced, that for a moment my body obeyed before my mind could catch up. I stepped forward. The man in the armchair still hadn't moved. His eyes tracked me across the room with that same unnerving stillness, and when I was close enough to see the details of his face, the sharp jaw, the high cheekbones, the mouth set in a flat, unreadable line, I finally stopped moving. "Marcus." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "What is this?" Marcus didn't answer. He picked up one of the stacks of cash and turned it over in his hands with a faint, satisfied smile, like a man who has just collected a prize he was owed. "Marcus." Louder this time. My hands had gone cold. "What did you do?" "It's handled, Isabelle." He didn't look up. "The debt is handled. You're going to stay here for a while, and when everything is settled I'm going to what?" The words came out broken. Not loud, not dramatic, just fractured the way glass sounds when it cracks before it shatters. I turned to face the man in the armchair fully for the first time, and something about the way he was watching me, patient, quiet, already knowing how this moment would end, made the air leave my lungs in one long, terrible exhale. "He sold you." The man's voice was low. Not loud, not aggressive. It was the kind of voice that didn't need volume because the room naturally arranged itself to hear it. "To cover $240,000 in gambling debt owed to my syndicate. The document is signed. The transaction is complete." I turned back to Marcus. He had pocketed the first stack of bills. Something in me broke then. Not loudly, not with the dramatic collapse I might have imagined in a different life. It broke the way the last light breaks at the end of a long day, quietly and without ceremony, taking the warmth with it. I looked at the man I had defended, to my mother, to my friends, to every person who had ever warned me. I looked at the man I had cooked for and covered for and believed in with a stubbornness that I had always mistaken for love. He didn't look back. He was counting. "Get out." The man in the armchair said it to Marcus without raising his voice, without breaking his gaze from my face. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really a command. It was the kind of sentence that simply described an outcome, the way gravity describes a fall. Marcus pocketed the last stack, straightened his jacket and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, just for a second, just long enough for me to wonder if he was going to turn around, to say something, to give me anything at all to hold on to. He didn't turn around. The door closed behind him, and the sound of it, quiet, final, the soft mechanical click of an expensive latch, was the loneliest sound I had ever heard in my life. The man didn't speak to me immediately after Marcus left. He rose from the armchair, unhurried, sovereign, and moved to the window that overlooked the rain-slicked city. The neon of the skyline fractured in the wet glass, smearing the city's lights into long, bleeding strokes of pink and gold and electric blue. He stood with his back to me, his hands loose at his sides, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the rain against the glass and the distant hum of a city that had no idea what happened inside this building. Thought about running. I considered it in the methodical, desperate way you consider an option you already know is impossible. The door was behind me. The stairwell would be guarded. The man at the window was not someone who lost things. Mong Kwan. He said it without turning around, as if he knew I had been trying to place a name to him. "That is what you will hear people call me." I didn't answer. He turned from the window. His eyes moved to the document on the table, then back to me. "You're not a prisoner. You are a guest under terms of protection. There is a difference, and you will learn it. A guest doesn't get sold," I said. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite respect, but something adjacent to both. He looked at me for another moment, that same chess player gaze, and then he moved toward the door. "Come," he said. I didn't move. "Where?" "Somewhere that isn't here." He held the door open and waited, and the patience in his posture was more terrifying than any threat would have been. It was the patience of a man who had never in his life needed to ask twice. I came. The car was black, long, and soundless in the way that only the most expensive vehicles are soundless, as if the outside world has been surgically removed and replaced with a sealed, pressurized silence. I sat on the far side of the rear seat, my back pressed to the door, my hands folded in my lap with the rigid, controlled stillness of someone trying very hard not to fall apart in front of a stranger. Mong Kwan sat on the opposite side. He had not touched me. He had not spoken since we descended from the study. He was looking out his window at the blurred city rushing past, his profile sharp and unreadable in the reflected glow of the streetlights. I told myself that the silence meant I still had time. That as long as no one was speaking, nothing irreversible was happening. I told myself a great many things in that car that I no longer believe. You're wondering where we're going. He said it without turning from the window. I'm wondering if I'm going to be alive when we get there. He turned his head then. Fully. He studied my face with that calculating stillness, and I forced myself to hold his gaze even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to look away. If I wanted you dead, he said, you would not have left that room. It was the most straightforward thing anyone had ever said to me, and somehow it was also the most comforting. Not because it was kind, it wasn't, but because it was honest, and honesty was something I had been starving for so long that even its coldest form felt like nourishment. I looked back out the window. The city shifted around us as we moved deeper into its wealthiest corridors, the crumbling storefronts and yellow streetlights of the industrial blocks giving way to wide, clean boulevards lined with buildings that looked like architecture and not just structures. Towers of glass and steel that reflected the wet sky with an almost arrogant clarity. The car stopped in front of one of them. I looked up at it through the window. 60 stories at least, all black glass and sharp angles, the kind of building that had no sign on the front because the people who needed to know what it was already knew. A man opened the car door from outside. He didn't look at me. His eyes went immediately to Mong Kwan with the reflexive, deep deference of someone who has long since stopped thinking of obedience as a choice. Mong Kwan stepped out of the car. He didn't offer me a hand. He simply walked toward the entrance, and I understood instinctively that his expectation of my presence was not something he expressed verbally. I followed. The penthouse was the last thing I expected. I had been preparing myself on the ride up in the elevator for something severe. A locked room. Bare walls. A window that opened onto nothing. The kind of space designed to communicate powerlessness. Instead, the elevator doors opened directly into the living room, and the first thing I saw was the city. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, and beyond it, Seoul laid out like a fallen constellation. Every light a fixed burning point in the dark, the whole skyline shimmering in the aftermath of the rain. The furniture was dark leather and warm wood, clean lines, nothing excessive. A kitchen that looked like it had never been disordered. A hallway leading to rooms I hadn't yet been shown. There were no bars. There were no locks I could see. There was no one standing at the door with folded hands and a watchful expression. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, trying to make sense of it. The room at the end of the hall is yours. Mong Kwan had moved to the kitchen and was pouring water from a glass pitcher with the unhurried ease of a man in his own home. He set a glass on the counter near me without making a production of it. The door locks from the inside. I looked at him. From the inside? Your privacy is yours. He picked up his own glass. I don't require access to your space. But I don't have access to the outside. Not yet. He said it plainly without apology. Not until I can guarantee it's safe for you to move without an escort. The people Marcus borrowed from are not limited to my syndicate. There are others who know your face now. He paused. You are safer here than anywhere else in this city. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to tell him that safety handed down from a captor was still captivity, that the name you put on a cage didn't change its walls. But the words stalled somewhere between my chest and my throat because the thing I kept returning to, the thing I could not stop replaying, was the image of Marcus pocketing that last stack of bills without looking back. And the city below, gleaming and indifferent, offered me no alternatives. I picked up the glass of water. I drank it. It was for that night, the only choice I had left to make. 3 days passed before I understood the difference between where I was and where I had feared I would be. Mong Kwan was rarely in the penthouse. He moved through it in the early morning and late at night, as if the space were a place he visited rather than inhabited. He never spoke to me unnecessarily. He never lingered. But he also never made me feel like a burden or an oversight. There was food in the kitchen every morning that I hadn't prepared, clothes in the wardrobe in my size that I hadn't asked for, and a silence in the apartment that felt unsettlingly more like respect than neglect. On the fourth day I made a mistake. I woke before dawn and followed the sound of voices to the living room. The floor was cold beneath my feet, the city still dark beyond the glass. I stopped in the hallway and watched through the gap in the door. There were 4 men seated in the living room. 3 of them I had never seen. They wore dark suits and the careful, controlled posture of men accustomed to violence. The way they held their hands slightly away from their bodies, the way their eyes moved constantly without appearing to move at all. The 4th man was Mong Kwan. He was not seated the way he was when I first saw him, contained, still, sovereign in repose. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, and the men behind him were speaking in low, urgent Korean that I couldn't follow. But I could hear the texture of it, the careful, measured deference in their voices, the way none of them finished a sentence without a pause that felt like a held breath, waiting for permission to continue. Then one of them placed a photograph on the glass table. Mong Kwan turned from the window and looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds the temperature of the room seemed to change. Not the air temperature, something deeper, something in the frequency of it, and the 3 suited men went very, very still. He said one sentence in Korean. I didn't understand the words. But every man in that room understood the weight behind them, because 2 of them stood immediately, and the 3rd looked at the photograph one more time before sliding it off the table and into his jacket. They were gone in under a minute. No goodbyes, no acknowledgements, no sound of footsteps in the hall. Mong Kwan stood alone at the window again. He had not turned around. But his voice, when it came, was quiet and entirely unsurprised. You should go back to sleep, Isabelle. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer, my heart loud in my chest, and understood with complete and sudden clarity that the man I was looking at was not an enforcer or a soldier or even a very successful criminal. He was the authority those things answered to. He was the source. I went back to my room. I lay in the dark with my eyes open and thought about the photograph. The way the men had looked at it, the way Mong Kwan had looked at it, the economy of violence in a single sentence. And for the first time since I had walked into that study with Marcus, I felt something other than grief. I felt the specific electric fear of realizing you are standing much closer to the center of something than you originally thought. It was on the 6th day that I saw what his authority actually looked like in practice. He had taken me for the first time outside of the penthouse. Not into the city but down into the building's lower floors where the offices were. He had said nothing about why. He had simply come to my door that morning and said, I need you close today, and the phrasing of it, not stay close but I need you close, as if my proximity were something that served him rather than inconvenienced me, had made me follow without asking. The floors below the penthouse were not what I expected. They were corporate in their surface appearance. Clean lines, dark wood paneling, men at desks with laptops and encrypted phones. But the energy underneath was wrong in the way that a beautiful building can be wrong when you realize its architecture is designed to keep things in rather than keep things out. We moved through a corridor lined with glass offices, and every person we passed stopped what they were doing. Not theatrically, they didn't bow or announce him. They simply became still in the way that prey becomes still when it senses something larger moving nearby. And they stayed still until he had passed. We entered a conference room at the end of the corridor. There were 6 men already seated at the long table, and one of them, a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the florid, self-satisfied color of someone who eats expensively and exercises not at all, did not stand when Mong Kwan entered. He looked at me instead. He looked at me the way Marcus's friends had always looked at me, assessingly, dismissively, with the specific contempt of a man who sees a woman in a room full of men and assumes she is decorative. He leaned back in his chair with a slow, deliberate ease and said something in Korean that made 2 of the other men at the table look immediately at the surface in front of them. I didn't need a translation. Mong Kwan stopped walking. The room went so quiet so fast that I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. He turned his head toward the heavy-set man with the slow, precise movement of someone who has all the time in the world and none of the patience. And the look on his face was not anger. Anger would have been almost manageable. What crossed Mong Kwan's face was something colder and more absolute. the expression of a man recalculating the value of someone who has just made themselves a problem. He spoke. 3 sentences, Korean quiet. The heavy-set man's color changed. The florid, self-important pink drained out of his face the way color drains out of a cut when the cold sets in, fast and complete, leaving something pale and exposed and suddenly very aware of its own fragility. He rose from his chair. He looked at Mong Kwan and then he looked at me and then he looked at the floor. He said something short and strained that had the unmistakable cadence of an apology. Mong Kwan looked at me. Not to check my reaction. Not to perform the gesture for my benefit. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in that study on the first night. Steady, complete, already decided. And then he moved to his chair at the head of the table and sat down, and the meeting resumed as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I stood at the side of the room with my arms folded and my breathing carefully controlled, and I thought about the way those 6 men were now sitting. Forward, attentive, with the careful posture of people who had just been reminded of something important. And I thought about the heavy-set man's face in the moment before the color left it. And I understood with a quiet and unsettling certainty that Mong Kwan had just made a public declaration in a language I didn't speak, in a room full of men who understood every word of it. He had told them what I was worth. And the number he had given was not one any of them would challenge again. That night I waited for him in the kitchen. I don't know exactly why. I had spent 6 days operating on the assumption that the less I engaged with Mong Kwan, the more intact my sense of self would remain. Every instinct I had told me that proximity to him was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat. That the real danger was subtler, slower, the kind that moved in under the cover of gratitude and protection and the particular warmth of being chosen by someone whose choices cost something. But I was tired of performing indifference in an empty apartment. He came in after midnight. He stopped when he saw me briefly, and then continued to the kitchen as if finding me there was something he had already adjusted to. What did you say to him? I asked. In the conference room. He opened a cabinet and retrieved a glass. I told him that disrespect shown to someone in my protection is disrespect shown to me. He poured water, turned, leaned against the counter. And that there is a specific and well-documented consequence for that. That's all. That's enough. I looked at him. He was still in his work clothes, the dark shirt, the ink visible at his collar and forearms, but something about him at midnight in a kitchen was fractionally different from every other version of him I had seen. Less performed. Less arranged. He was still Mong Kwan in all the ways that mattered, but the sovereignty was resting rather than active. The way a city looks different at 3 in the morning when the lights are still on but the performance has stopped. Why? I said. He tilted his head. Why what? Why does it matter? What happens to me in that room? What someone says about me? You don't know me. I am, according to the document on that table, a transaction. He was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone searching for an answer, but the considered silence of someone deciding how much of a true one to give. A transaction, he said slowly, is completed and forgotten. It has no ongoing value. He set the glass down. What you are is something I chose to keep. Those are not the same thing. The words landed differently than I expected. Not as a comfort exactly, but as information. The kind of information that changes the shape of a situation you thought you understood. I wanted to say something sharp back. I wanted to maintain the careful distance I had been building since the first night, the glass wall of wariness that I had been using to remind myself of what this was and wasn't. But the memory of Marcus counting those bills without looking up was still fresh and still cutting, and standing in the kitchen at midnight with a man who had publicly defended my dignity in a room full of powerful men who feared him was doing something to the glass wall that I didn't entirely have language for yet. So I said nothing. I picked up my water glass from the counter and walked back down the hall to my room, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I thought about the difference between a transaction and something kept. And I thought about the fact that no one, not once in 3 years with Marcus, had ever made that distinction about me. Before we continue to the next part of Isabelle's story, make sure you subscribe to Fearless Love Chronicles so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Isabelle is starting to feel something for Mong Kwan, or is she still just surviving? Let me know below. It truly means a lot to see our Fearless Love Chronicles family growing every single week. Every like and every share helps us tell more stories about women who walk into fire and come out wearing the crown, and I am so grateful we get to build this world together. I didn't think about Marcus much in the second week. That surprised me. I had spent 3 years thinking about Marcus in the way that people think about the weather, constantly, involuntarily organizing my days around his moods and his needs and his version of events. He had occupied so much interior space that I had mistaken his presence for personality, his demands for passion. I had confused the weight of him for substance. But in the penthouse, in the quiet and the clean lines and the city spread out below me like a secret I was being allowed to keep, I found that the space he had occupied was filling with other things. Observations. Questions. The slow, careful process of a woman taking stock of herself after a long time of not being allowed to. I noticed when Mong Kwan's schedule changed. I noticed when he returned later than usual, when the quality of his silence was different, when the men who came and went from the lower floors moved with a slightly heightened urgency that hadn't been there the week before. I noticed these things the way you notice shifts in air pressure before a storm. Not with alarm exactly, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who has learned that the atmosphere is always trying to tell you something. I didn't know yet that Marcus was the storm. He had burned through the money within 10 days. I would learn the details later. The sequence of bad decisions that were, in retrospect, entirely predictable for a man who had gambled away $240,000 over 18 months and somehow still believed he was one lucky night away from being whole again. He had found a table. He had found another table. He had borrowed from people who made Mong Kwan's syndicate look like a charity organization, and he had lost that too. What he had left was a name. I learned later that he had told them, the men he owed, the ones who were running out of patience for his promises, that he knew where a high-value asset was being held. That he had personal access. That if they gave him 2 weeks and a crew, he could extract the asset and use her as leverage against the Korean syndicate that had absorbed his original debt. He had framed me as a hostage in a negotiation I didn't know was happening. He had framed himself as someone with access. He had built a plan on the foundation of a lie, and the lie was this: that Mong Kwan would care enough about disruption to negotiate. That I was a liability to be managed rather than something that had been chosen. Marcus had always been very good at believing what he needed to believe. The first sign was a sound. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night, and I was in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading, the city glittering in its usual extravagance beyond the glass. Mong Kwan was not home. He had sent a message through one of his men in the late afternoon that he would be late, and the message had been delivered with the same neutral efficiency as everything else in this building. A small white card slid under my door that read only late tonight. Don't wait up. I had held the card for a moment longer than necessary, turning it over in my fingers, before setting it on the nightstand with more deliberateness than the gesture required. The sound was wrong. Not loud, that was the thing. A loud sound in a building like this would have meant nothing, would have been swallowed by the insulation and the distance and the machinery of a 60-story tower managing its own existence. But this sound was wrong in the specific way that a quiet sound in a quiet building is wrong. Not in its volume but in its source, in the fact that it was coming from somewhere it shouldn't have been able to come from. The stairwell. The building had elevators and a service corridor, and the stairwells were locked at every floor with a biometric system that had been explained to me on my second day here in the flat. Informational tone that Mong Kwan used to explain everything. The stairwells are secured. If the power goes out, you will hear a chime and the secondary locks will engage. Do not use the stairwells unless I am with you. He hadn't said why. He hadn't needed to. I stood up from the couch. The sound came again. A dull, rhythmic something too irregular to be mechanical, too persistent to be random. And then, underneath it, the faintest percussion of boots on concrete, moving upward. My body understood before my mind did. My mind was still constructing rational explanations. Maintenance, a drill, something routine that I didn't have context for. But my body had already moved to the kitchen and my hand had already found the handle of the heaviest pan on the rack. And I was already pressed against the wall beside the elevator doors before I had consciously decided to do any of it. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. 3 men I had never seen stepped out into the penthouse, and behind them, with the sheepish, forward-leaning posture of a man who has convinced himself that confidence is something you can borrow from people who aren't afraid, was Marcus. He looked worse than I expected. The gray suit was gone, replaced by dark clothes that were meant to be inconspicuous and only managed to look like a man wearing a costume of a criminal. His face had the tight, over-rehearsed expression of someone who has been running a plan through their head so many times that they've mistaken familiarity for competence. He saw me and something crossed his face that I think was relief. He had expected me to still be the woman he left in that room. Isabelle. He said my name the way he always said it. Easy, familiar, as if continuity were something he was owed. As if 11 days and a glass table covered in blood money were just a rough patch we were moving past together. I came for you. I came to get you out. I looked at him. I looked at the 3 men behind him, large, watchful, carrying the flat-eyed stillness of men who were being paid rather than convinced. I looked at Marcus's face, at the relief and the self-regard and the fundamental bottomless belief that I would respond the way I had always responded, that loyalty was a reflex in me that survived even the clearest evidence of who he was. You sold me, I said. My voice was very calm. I know. He stepped forward. One hand raised, conciliatory, the gesture of a man in a negotiation. I know, and I'm sorry, and we can talk about all of that, but right now we need to move. I have people waiting and there's a window, and if we don't go now. You sold me, I said again. To pay a debt you made. You counted the money without looking at me. And now you're here because you need something again. He stopped moving. Behind him, one of the 3 men had shifted his weight, his hand moving to something at his waist. The penthouse felt suddenly very small and very bright, the city outside indifferent and gleaming, completely unaware of what was happening 60 floors above its streets. Marcus's expression changed. The rehearsed confidence faltered around the edges, and underneath it I could see the thing that had always been underneath it. The scrambling, self-preserving calculation of a man who only ever had one mode and had mistaken it for personality. Isabelle. Sharper now. I'm trying to help you. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's made you think. You are a hostage in a criminal's building and I am here to get you out. Now please come with me before. The lights went out. Not the city lights. Those blazed on, indifferent, painting the room in the fractured neon of the skyline. But the interior lights, every fixture in the penthouse, went dark simultaneously, and in the half-second before anyone could react, the air changed completely. It was the same shift I had felt in the conference room. The same drop in frequency, the same rearrangement of the room's fundamental weight. But this time it was faster and larger and coming from multiple directions at once. I heard it before I saw anything. Not violence exactly, or not the kind of violence I had imagined, which was loud and uncontrolled and desperate in the way that fear makes things desperate. What I heard was efficient, methodical. The sounds of a confrontation conducted by someone who had mapped the terrain, calculated the variables, and arrived at outcomes before the first move was made. A short, compressed impact. The grunt of expelled breath. The skid of a heel on marble. Then another. Then silence. Then the lights came back on. Mong Kwan was standing in the center of the living room. He was not breathing hard. His shirt had one torn seam at the shoulder, and there was a cut above his jaw that was bleeding in a thin, clean line. But he was standing the way he always stood, occupying the space, making the geometry of the room arrange itself around him without appearing to try. The 3 men who had come in with Marcus were on the floor. Not dead, I could see that from where I stood, could see the rise and fall of breathing, but thoroughly, completely removed from the situation. Zip ties at the wrists. Faces to the marble. 2 of Mong Kwan's men were at the elevator doors. Another was at the stairwell entrance. They had appeared from somewhere, from the building itself, it seemed, from the machinery of the tower that had been watching all along, and they held their positions now with the still, arranged silence of people who are waiting for an instruction that hasn't been given yet. Mong Kwan looked at me first. One swift, complete sweep, checking for damage, cataloging my condition. When he was satisfied, when something in his assessment told him I was whole, he turned his gaze to Marcus. Marcus was backed against the glass wall. The city burned behind him, 60 floors of nothing beneath his heels, and his face had gone the color of old ash. He was holding both hands up in front of him, empty, palms out, the universal grammar of a man with nothing left but his own skin. Wait. His voice had dissolved into something thin and high. Wait, I can. Be quiet. Mong Kwan said it without heat. The words weren't a threat. They were instructions, the way you instruct a mechanism to stop. And Marcus, who had always had an answer, who had always had a story, who had navigated 3 years of mounting debt on the currency of his own relentless narration, stopped talking. The silence that followed had a texture. I could feel it against my skin. Mong Kwan walked across the room with slow, deliberate steps and stopped in front of Marcus. He was taller than Marcus by 2 inches, but in that moment the gap between them seemed geological. The distance between a mountain and the man standing at its base, finally understanding what he had walked toward. You were given money, Mong Kwan said. His voice was quiet and entirely without passion. You were given a clean exit from a debt that could have ended your life. You were given more mercy than this syndicate has shown anyone in 7 years. He paused. And you spent 10 days destroying that mercy, borrowing from dangerous men, and building a plan to use a woman as leverage. Marcus swallowed. Tell me, Mong Kwan continued in the same conversational register, what outcome did you imagine for tonight? Marcus said nothing. Did you imagine she would come with you? That you would walk her out of this building and she would thank you? He tilted his head slightly, genuinely curious in the way that people are curious about things they cannot comprehend. Did you believe she still belonged to you in some way that superseded the choice she made to survive here? She didn't make a choice. Marcus's voice came back, smaller and cracked but present, clinging to the last available surface of his narrative. She didn't choose any of this. You took her. I bought a debt, Mong Kwan said. You sold a person. He let that sit between them for a moment, let it take up the space it deserved. There is a distinction, and you will spend the rest of whatever time you have left understanding it. Marcus looked past him then. He looked at me. And this was the moment I had not prepared for. Not the men on the floor, not the city behind the glass, not even Mong Kwan's quiet and devastating inventory of Marcus's failures. It was this. Marcus looking at me with the face he had always been able to use. The face that preceded every apology, every explanation, every renegotiation. The face that had made me feel every single time, as though my anger were something he was generously enduring on the way to my forgiveness. Isabelle. Soft. Broken sounding. Please. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the gray suit replaced by dark clothes. I looked at the hands that had counted money. I looked at the mouth that had said it's handled with the ease of a man discarding a bill and not a person. I looked at the eyes that were doing the thing they always did, filling with exactly the right amount of vulnerability to make me feel responsible for the outcome of his choices. And I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not love. Not even anger, which would have been almost easier to carry because anger is at least forward-facing. What I felt was older and quieter and more complete. The particular sadness of recognizing something clearly for the very first time and understanding that clarity in this case could not be undone. I saw him. I saw him fully without the filter of hope that I had been wearing for 3 years like a second skin. I saw the smallness underneath the charm, the self-regard underneath the apologies, the boy underneath the man who had never once, in all the time I had known him, chosen me over his own comfort. No, I said. One word. Short and clean, the way a door sounds when it closes on something that needed to be finished. Marcus blinked. Isabelle. No. I said it again, and it was steadier the second time, the way your footing steadies when you find solid ground after a long time of not knowing what you were standing on. I'm not going to save you. I'm not going to tell him to let you go. I'm not going to stand here and watch you turn what you did into a story where you're the one who needs saving and I'm the one who's supposed to provide it. I paused. I know that version of the story. I've lived it for 3 years. I'm done. The silence that followed was absolute. Mong Kwan had not moved. He was still standing between us, but he had turned his head slightly to look at me when I started speaking, and his expression, that face that gave away almost nothing, that face I had spent 11 days trying to decode, had shifted into something I hadn't seen on it before. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Something that looked almost like recognition. He waited until Marcus and the 3 men had been removed from the penthouse, efficiently, without drama, escorted into the elevator by 2 of his men with the impersonal precision of a building removing a problem from its system, before he turned to me. I was standing by the window. I had moved there at some point during the removal process without noticing, drawn to the city the way I was always drawn to it in moments when the room was too full. 60 stories down, the streets moved on. Cars in slow threads of light. People who had no idea what had just happened above them, who would go to sleep tonight and wake up tomorrow in a city where the balance of power had shifted slightly, imperceptibly, the way it always does and no one ever marks. I heard him come to stand behind me. Not close enough to touch. He never closed distance without an implicit invitation, but close enough that I could see his reflection in the glass, overlaid on the city like a transparency. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." Then after a moment, "I think so." "You don't have to be certain." He said it plainly, without softness but also without edge. It was the kind of statement that only works when it's completely true, and coming from him it was completely true. He was not interested in performances. He had never asked me to be anything other than what I was in any given moment, and that consistency, that particular relentless consistency, had done something to me that I hadn't been tracking carefully enough. "What will happen to him?" I asked. "He will be removed from the city." He paused. "Permanently. Not killed. But every bridge he might use to come back will be burned. Every debt he has will be restructured in a way that ensures he is occupied elsewhere for a very long time." "That's mercy," I said, and I wasn't sure how I meant it. Whether I thought Marcus deserved it or whether I was surprised that Mong Kwan was offering it. "It's geography," he said. Mercy would be letting him believe he had a choice. I looked at his reflection in the glass. He was looking at the city, not at me, his profile sharp in the reflected light. "You came back," I said. "Tonight. You were supposed to be late." I was informed of the breach while I was still in the car. He said it simply. "I came back." "You came back fast." "Yes." I turned from the window. He turned at the same moment, and we were facing each other in the living room of the penthouse, with the city glowing behind me and the cut above his jaw still tracing its thin, clean line. And I thought about 11 days of water glasses on countertops and white cards slid under doors and conference rooms where he had named my value in front of men who feared him. I thought about a transaction is completed and forgotten. What you are is something I chose to keep. I thought about the night in the kitchen and the way he had looked at me when I asked him why, not performing an answer, not constructing one, but deciding how much of a true one to give. And the true one, when he gave it, had been enough. "I'm not leaving," I said. He looked at me. That chess player gaze, that absolute, already finished assessment. But this time something underneath it was different, something that had been there for a while, I thought, but that I was only now seeing clearly enough to name. "I know," he said. I stopped. "I'm choosing to stay. That's different from being kept. I need you to know that." Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Not exactly. But the architecture of his face changed in the small, significant way that faces change when a person stops holding something back. "It's different," he agreed. I nodded once, and the nod was a closing of something and an opening of something else simultaneously. The end of the woman who had stood in that study watching Marcus count money, and the beginning of whatever came after her. I didn't have a complete name for it yet. I didn't need one tonight. I reached out and touched the cut above his jaw. Not gently, I wasn't a gentle woman, I had just temporarily forgotten that. I pressed 2 fingers to the edge of it, assessing the way you touch a thing you intend to take care of. He went still under my hand with the particular stillness of someone who is not accustomed to being touched without an agenda, and I felt the stillness and didn't remove my hand. "You need something on this," I said. "Probably," he said. "Sit down." He sat. And in the kitchen of the penthouse, 60 floors above a city that feared the man in my care, I pressed a cloth to his jaw and thought about the difference between the life you survive and the life you choose. About the distance between those two things, which is not as vast as it seems from the outside. About the moment, which is not dramatic, not cinematic, which looks nothing like what you imagined, when you realize you have crossed it. Below us the city burned on. I was no longer afraid of it. I was no longer afraid of very much at all. And that is where Isabelle Dean's story turns. Not with a crown, not with a ceremony, but with a cloth pressed to a jaw in a lit kitchen while the city glows beyond the glass. She walked into that study as collateral and she walked out of it, eventually, as something no document could quantify and no transaction could contain. She walked out as herself. And the deadliest man in the Korean underworld, the man the city trembled for, sat still under her hands and let her take care of him. If that's not a throne, I don't know what is. Before you go, if this story moved you at all, please subscribe to Fearless Love Chronicles and leave us a like. Takes 2 seconds and it changes everything for this channel. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Isabelle made the right choice staying, or would you have walked away? I want to hear every single opinion. It truly means a lot to see our Fearless Love Chronicles family growing week after week. Every share, every comment, every new subscriber helps us tell more stories about women who walked through fire and came out wearing the crown. And I am so deeply grateful that we get to build this world together. Stay with us. The next story is already waiting and I promise you, it will keep you up all night.